I have lived life slow. I've lived life really slow. And what I mean by that is, I didn't graduate college until I was 25. I attended university for 6 years. I started my first real job at 30. I didn't have kids until I was 40. So it's a little I'm a little embarrassed to answer this question. Because the truth is, I didn't even know until I became a parent. Yeah. And I've heard a lot of, so I taught high school math for 14 years, and I would hear other teachers talk about, you can't really be a good teacher unless you have kids. And I'm not going to go that far because I think that's a really broad statement.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot easier to have certain experiences as a parent than not as a parent. Mm-hmm. And noticing what my dad must have gone through wasn't evident to me until I had kids.
Yeah.
I would say 5 years ago, or three years ago, when I started taking my kids to sporting activities. Mm-hmm. That's when I really realized it.
So I'd say you're not as far behind as you think, because there's a majority of people, a majority of men that I talk to still don't have that thought process and still haven't worked through the fact that they're holding on to stuff that they wish they would have got from their dad, or that they think their dad did wrong, or that, and it's one of those that the second you can kind of, or maybe not the second, it takes a little bit, but when you start to really step back and look at the life that, your dad may have experienced, and what he was still able to provide for you, even if, and these are the terrible spots, right, where let's say you have an extremely abusive father, right? If you could step back and say, what was it about my father that led him to be extremely abusive, right? If we could step back and kind of look through those scenarios and those classes and say, man, while I haven't talked to my dad in 15 years because there's no way I'm going to go talk to that evil, horrible human being, can we step back and realize what they may have done, or why it was they may have been living, and how sad this person must have been inside to have been committing those atrocities, or maybe how badly abused they were, which is why they ended up going down that path. Like my dad was rather poorly abused, right? It was rough. He had a very rough upbringing. And he never once laid a hand on me. He threatened it once. He did threaten it once. It's a semi-funny story. We'll do a quick aside. I don't know if I've ever told this story on the podcast before either, but my dad was working at Sing Sing prison down in New York City, and we were living in way upstate New York. My sisters would gang up on me all the time. So I have two older sisters, and they would gang up on me all the time. Well, one time they threw me down the stairs in a sleeping bag, right? Yeah, pleasant, right? So I got up and punched my sister in the face. I punched her in the nose, and I gave her a bloody nose. Very justified by my books. Like one is 2 years older than me, the other's 4 years older than me. They threw me down the daggum stairs. I was angry, and when my dad came back, the fun way of saying it, when my dad came back from prison, and he was hanging out at the house, right? He told me, he said, "You ever want to hit a woman again, we'll go in the backyard and we'll see if you can hit me." And I was in like 5th grade, I think, at the time. And never once did I ever try to do that. And my sisters basically nee the entire time, because they were like, hey, there's no way, we've got free reign now, right? So of course they continued to harass me, and I did absolutely nothing. But that was the only time that my dad ever threatened it. And I think to myself, especially later on, and I'm like, that could have gone so much more south if he'd have taken the route that his stepdad did. Right. And to sit there and realize the things that he went through that he never passed on to me. He made sure that there was a break in that line to where it wasn't passed to me. And I'm unbelievably grateful for that break in line that has allowed me to now be an even better father. Not that there's like these levels of being better or worse, but he's allowed me to be a more present father and an understanding father than I ever would have been had I not thought through that. So
you feel proud of the father you can be in ways you might not have otherwise.
And proud of my father, right, for what he could have been, right? Like he could have been on the other side of those bars in Sing Sing based off of his upbringing, but instead he was on the correct side with the badge on, So it makes me proud of the reset that he made for all of us. So I'm saying all that to say, to go back to what you were talking about, is I don't think you're late to the game, because you're in the game. You thought about it, right? And you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, now how does this help me show up better as a dad? How can I, help my kids understand who their grandpa is? And, now he's living in the house. Like, how awesome is that?
Yeah.
So since he is living in the house, like, have you, in these last 3 years, since you've kind of been thinking about that, have you had any of those conversations with him to kind of pick apart how that goes? What were those conversations like?
Well, I want to go back. I will come back to answer your question, but there were a couple things that that kind of clicked for me in what you said. One of them is gratitude around how your father was, and even if you had an abusive father. I was just listening to a podcast about gratitude, and it was about practicing gratitude. And we live in my experience is I've met a lot of people who hold a lot of resentment against their parents, their dad or their mom or both. And to me, it seems like maybe some of that is related to talk therapy. And I'm not saying that talk therapy is bad. I've benefited greatly from talk therapy. However, when we talk to a lot of therapists, one of the things we talk about is how our childhood affects who we show up as now. And that's real. I mean, it just is. But there seems to be sometimes this blaming of the parent and their behavior for who I'm showing up as now.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying therapists do that. I think people hear that and internalize it in that way.
It's so much easier to blame somebody else than it is to take anything on yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this podcast, I've done a fair amount of gratitude practices, and one of my teachers would often qualify the expression of gratitude towards your mother and if you can't generate gratitude for your mother, then find someone who you might have thought of as a mother and generate gratitude towards them. And I think that's a great practice, and there's more to it, but it's a great practice because, listen, if you can't, you can't, and you need to practice generating gratitude. So find a place to start. But what I heard in this podcast that struck home with me was, you're alive. You couldn't have been alive without your mother and your father. Are you grateful for this opportunity to be alive and show up in the world? If you're grateful for that, then you can be grateful for your mother or father, regardless of whatever else they did, even if they gave you up for adoption and you never knew them. And I think that that's like a touch point for gratitude towards parents that I had never really thought about. I thought was pretty a cool place to start.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I really like. I mean, it's a like I was saying, there's and you're foot stomping there. Even if you were abused as a child, right? Like maybe it gave you a little bit more mental strength than you would have had. Maybe it gave you an understanding of how to show up better today, right? Because of that. That doesn't mean you're thankful that you got punched in the face by your dad or by your mom, or thankful that they beat you in one way or shape or form. But it's thankful that you can recognize how I can now show up better for my kids, how I can show up better for how I can support my wife better, how I can support my kids better, how I can show up better as an employee or an employer. Like that's something you can be grateful for. It's but it's all about perspective. If you have the perspective of to kind of go off of what you were saying more, I think we live in a world right now in which we celebrate victims and victimhood as opposed to celebrating adversity, and breaking through adversity. We'd rather celebrate the fact that somebody's a victim for one reason or another, and we're all victims for one reason or another. It doesn't matter. I'm a straight white male, and I can promise you I can come up with 100 different reasons why I'm a victim in one way, shape, or form. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've been through. Everybody can. It's whether or not we choose to, right? I've got a thing on my board up here. It says the three monsters that we don't feed: resistance, distraction, and victimhood. I'm not going to feed a victimhood mentality. I'm not going to just sit here and be resistant to everything that comes my way, and I'm not going to sit here and thrive on distraction. That one right there is the hardest one for me, the distraction part. I tend to get little bit too distracted, a little bit too easy. But that's a a different story, right? But we're not going to feed those things, because those are going to tear you down. They're not going to build you up. But no, I never really related it to the talk therapy side of the house, but it does make a lot of sense to me that, like that's really, again, therapy I think is great. I'm right there with you in understanding and appreciating the fact that therapy is a great thing. But if all it does is cast blame somewhere, there's a book Jocko Willink wrote called Extreme Ownership. I don't know if you ever read it, but it is phenomenal. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he talks about extreme ownership. And he's like, look, you could have had absolutely nothing to do with the decision making, but own the outcome. It's yours. Like, just what could I have done to make things different? And if we all have a little bit more extreme ownership, I think that ends up being a lot better in both business and family and everything.